True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Back in the winter of 1985, two friends from Detroit set out on a hunting trip in rural Michigan. Brian Ognjan and David Tyll, both 27 years old at the time, had been looking forward to this trip, and they'd actually planned it for weeks. But somewhere along the way, the hunters became the hunted. They vanished somewhere in the bitter cold, leaving behind a legacy of grief and confusion. Join us at the quiet end for Into the Cold. On November 22nd, Brian and David headed out for David's family cabin in White Cloud. David picked up Brian cashed a check, and they left. They thought that they might stop to visit a friend along the way, but they never arrived at the cabin or at the friend's home. In fact, they were never seen again. And David's vehicle, a 1980 black Ford Bronco, has never been found either. So it's a mystery, really. There have been some conclusions, but none of it 100%.
So I'm glad we have a Michigan case, because I get to drink a Michigan beer. I chose one of my favorite breweries, Founders Brewery in Grand Rapids, and they put out a beer called Nemesis, and it's an American barley wine. So it's a little bit on the strong side, 11.2%. I'll share with you. We got one bottle, 6 ounces each. How's that?
That sounds fair enough.
So it's a pretty good-looking beer. A really deep mahogany color, a finger width of tan head, and a lot of lacing on the sides as you drink. The aroma is caramel, dark fruit, and some piney hops. And the taste follows the nose pretty much exactly. You get some caramel, toffee, a little raisin, and some pine. Just a wonderful beer.
Yeah, it really does seem amazing. Let's open it up because I want to smell it.
Yeah, you got to take a whiff.
Yeah. It's kind of like a fluffy mattress that you sink into. That's how it smells.
Okay.
And tastes even better. So come on down to the quiet end, and we will have Dick start us off with this story that goes back a ways, but there's so many twists and turns, and who knows exactly what happened. I don't think we ever will.
No, we won't.
No.
I mean, only a few people know what really happened.
That's right. Right. The victims and the perpetrators, basically.
Yeah.
Yep. Maybe a witness or two.
Maybe. So these two boys grew up together, Brian and David. They've been buddies since Brian moved to the East Side Detroit neighborhood when they were in 4th grade. They both attended Gabriel Richard, a Catholic school, through the 9th grade. Then they went to public high school. They'd grown from boys to men together, sharing the joys and heartaches of their childhoods and adolescences.
And that's saying a lot, because those are the years that are really tough and kind of make you who you are in many ways.
They sure can.
Yeah.
So in 1985, they were both 27 years old. David was a machinist, living in an apartment in the upper middle-class Detroit suburb of Troy. Brian was a mechanic in St. Clair Shores, which is another suburb just a few miles from where they'd grown up. Both were responsible young men. They'd smoked a little marijuana occasionally in the 70s, and sometimes went to the bar for a couple of beers and to play some pool. But they worked hard, they saved their money, paid their bills, and stayed out of trouble.
Well, that's what their families would say, but that's a little questionable too, because we're not sure what they were really up to that weekend. Some things seem like they were just a little different than what they said they had planned.
Yeah, you'll find that out when we start talking about their trip.
Exactly. So on Friday, November 22nd, 1985, Brian and David left for a weekend of deer hunting at David's family cabin near White Cloud. That's a small town on the western side of the state. David wasn't a big hunter. In fact, he'd never even killed a deer. So hunting really wasn't one of the highlights of his year, as it was for some hunters. Most years he just went along, but it wasn't really the important part of the trip. For him, a deer stand was more of a quiet place to recover from a hangover than it was a stealthy place to shoot a deer from. Brian wasn't much of a hunter either. though he went every year too, mostly to drink beer with the guys and play some cards. His girlfriend Janice would joke about Brian and David, saying they see a deer, they wouldn't shoot it. So Brian wouldn't admit it to his guy friends, but he did tell Janice that he'd seen many deer walking by over the years and had never aimed or pulled the trigger. He just liked drinking with the guys at night and sitting out in the woods during the day. The two young men never even bought deer licenses. They'd mistakenly assumed that if they were hunting on private property, they didn't need them. And they had planned to go hunting the previous weekend, which was the opening weekend of deer season, but David decided to take his wife Denise to a party instead. So that's how they ended up going when they did. A grade school and high school buddy of theirs, Daniel Jacob, who stopped by Brian's most Saturday mornings to drink coffee and just kind of chat, was supposed to go with them, but then he had to cancel. David's father, Art, and one of his brothers, Archie, were already at the cabin hunting. So before they left, Brian joked with Art that he was going to get his money back from him at poker this year. Then another brother, Matt, and 3 of his buddies were leaving on Friday afternoon for the cabin as well. So there were going to be a lot of people there.
That's going to be kind of cozy.
Well, yeah, David came from a very large family. His mother, Catherine, had 13 kids. But that didn't stop her from working full-time as a nurse, so she was kind of a go-getter.
Yeah, well, she must have had some help.
Well, sure. I think when you have that many kids, the older kids have to help. So she used to tell people that of all her kids, David was the most level-headed. David's father-in-law owned the tool and die shop where he worked, called DeLand Manufacturing. And on the morning of the 22nd, David called his wife and told her that her father had given him the afternoon off so he could get ready for his trip. It wasn't a long trip, and he wouldn't need to pack many clothes. He had his Pittsburgh Steelers jacket and a green army jacket. He was wearing blue jeans and a flannel shirt. He did pack a sleeping bag to keep him warm in the drafty cabin at night, and a small duffel bag with some socks and hunting gear. They planned to return home about 6 p.m. Sunday night, so they could get a good night's sleep before going back to work that Monday.
So David drove over to Brian's house and arrived there about 2 in the afternoon. Brian's girlfriend Janice was pulling up in her car about the same time. Brian lived in a nice corner house on a main street that went all the way from downtown Detroit to Selfridge Air Force Base in Mount Clemens. He was proud of his house, and he kept it up quite nicely. He's a self-described neat freak, and he always had everything in its place. Brian was sleeping when David showed up, exhausted from the overtime he'd been putting in for Michigan Bell. His shift was 4 p.m. to midnight, but he routinely worked overtime till 4 or 5 in the morning, so Janice woke him up.
Yeah, about 3 p.m., David called Denise from Brian's house and asked her if she wanted to change her mind and go along with them. She declined, but it wasn't unusual for David to ask Denise to come along on outings with Brian. David asked her if she wanted him to call her later that night. The family cabin didn't have a telephone, and it was a 20-minute drive to the nearest payphone, so she told him not to bother. Of course, this is long before cell phones. So Janice wrote Brian a check for $50 to go with the $40 in cash that he already had in his wallet, just to make sure he had enough spending money. Brian was a saver, he had a bank account and stocks, and if he didn't need something, he wouldn't buy it. If he was short on cash, it was usually because he'd put more than he should have into his bank account. So Brian threw his gear together in minutes. His Marlin .35 caliber lever-action rifle, his sleeping bag, and enough clothes for the weekend. And then he put it into David's Bronco, alongside David's clothes and his 12-gauge pump-action Ithaca shotgun. And he told Janice he'd see her late Sunday afternoon. So about 5 p.m., David called his brother Matt and told him that they were coming up to the cabin. Matt and his buddies were already getting ready to leave. Several hours later, Matt and his friends dropped their gear off at the cabin, and then they went out to have drinks at a bar in White Cloud. They did leave David and Brian a note at the cabin saying where they'd be if the two arrived and wanted to join them on Friday night. But when Matt and the guys got back to the cabin, there was no sign of his brother or his friend. They didn't show up on Saturday or Sunday either.
But Matt and his father weren't worried. They assumed that David and Brian had changed their minds. Actually, Matt knew they were thinking of going up north instead. He knew David was having second thoughts because of how many people were going to be crammed into that cabin. So Janice started to worry on Sunday evening when Brian didn't return. That he had not called wasn't a surprise. There weren't any cell phones back then, and Brian was too frugal to splurge on a long-distance call. But he was always on time, so she was concerned.
Yeah, David was punctual and responsible, too. The kind of guy who would call his wife if he was going to be late. So by 10 p.m. Sunday night, David's wife Denise was getting scared, close to panicking, really. Her husband wasn't home as promised, and he hadn't called. So Denise called her father to make sure she hadn't misunderstood David's plans. Maybe he'd gotten Monday off of work, too, and was coming back on Monday night, not Sunday. But her dad said no, David was expected at work early Monday morning.
So Denise then called her in-laws. Matt answered, so she knew he was back already. "What time did Dave leave?" she asked. "Oh, about the same time I did," he answered. But he was vague when she asked him what time that was. He couldn't or wouldn't give her the time. At 1 a.m., really freaking out now, she called the state police to see if there had been any accidents or incidents involving Brian or David. There wasn't anything, so Denise tried to sleep, but she found that she couldn't. Just all those thoughts churning around in her head.
Well, Denise went to work the next day, and just after she got there, her mother-in-law Kathy called, and Matt had made a confession to her. Brian and David had never showed up at the cabin. Matt had been covering for his brother when she'd called him the night before, because he figured that they must have just decided at the last minute to go somewhere else and have a good time, and he didn't want David to get in trouble with her.
Had he said something to Matt to cover for him?
No, but he just assumed that since they didn't show up, they were probably off doing something else, and the wife wouldn't like it.
So is this a common thing?
Well, that's a good question, because we don't really know. But it doesn't seem like it, because it seems like they were expected home. Now, going off and having fun might not be that unusual, but they would be home on time and they wouldn't miss work.
Right.
So I guess that's what made this really unusual. So once Matt made that admission, then they're really worried. The guys had never even gotten to the cabin. Archie and their dad were still at the cabin, and the guys hadn't shown up on Monday either. So really panicked, Denise called another of David's brothers, Larry, who was Brian's roommate. Brian hadn't come home either. He hadn't called over the weekend. Denise knew something wasn't right, so she told her boss she had to leave work, and she drove over to the Troy Police Department to file a missing persons report. So here's where it all gets started, looking for these two men.
Yeah, and it sounds like maybe one of them had said something to the brother, take care of things.
I have no idea. We have no reason to believe that. I thought it was just like a bro code. If someone's wife or girlfriend calls, you cover for your buddy. I think that's kind of how they saw it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess you could look at it that way.
I think some people do look at it that way. I'm glad you don't, but I think it's not that uncommon, really. So Janice called Brian's parents in Florida and tried to file a report with the St. Clair Shores police. But because she wasn't a relative, they wouldn't take one from her. At 2:30 p.m., she called the state police again to ask if they knew about any accidents. And they didn't. So then Janice checked with her bank. Brian had cashed the check in St. Clair Shores on Friday, so he had done that. But then there was no other activity. And a whole week went by without any word from David or Brian. Over the long Thanksgiving weekend, Janice, Denise, Matt, and Janice's Uncle Dick drove up to the Tyll family cabin. Maybe Brian and David had gone somewhere else first and then arrived at the White Cloud cabin after everyone else had already gone. Maybe something had happened to their car and they were stuck there with no phone. So maybe they'd find a note this time. But no, they went there and there was no sign of the two at the cabin at all. So family members asked around. They checked the Cozy Bar, the Drift Inn, and the Highway Bar. They showed pictures and they sometimes got a no and other times got a maybe, but nothing concrete. No evidence or trust that anyone had really seen them. But there was no proof that they hadn't been seen either.
So the family stopped by the state police station, the local radio stations, and the newspaper. All promised to help them get the word out. They even hired a pilot to search from above. The plane was too small for all of them to ride in, so Matt got in and had the pilot fly him around White Cloud. He wasn't really sure what they'd be able to see from up in the air. Mostly they looked for the Bronco, because that would be something you could pick out. The search gave them a sense of doing something without accomplishing anything, but it made the time pass by better than sitting at home waiting for the phone to ring.
Yeah, so they eventually had to leave White Cloud, and they were feeling very confident at that point that Brian and David had never arrived there. So David was 6'2" and Brian was much shorter. so it seems like someone would have noticed them if they'd been hanging out together there. It really bothered Janice when, as soon as the TV crews started showing up, everyone all of a sudden had a story to tell and a possible sighting to share. So people really want attention, obviously. Then over the coming months, Denise kept checking David's credit card statement when it came, hoping that maybe there was some activity on it. But there was never anything new. She'd check his bank account too, and the balance never changed. So as it turned out, what no one knew at the time was that Brian and David had not gone to White Cloud. They had left St. Clair Shores, but they didn't head west. They drove up north, deep into the woods of northeastern Michigan. Their eventual destination was a 3-hour drive from where they decided to go. They could have begun not sure where they were going, but at some point early on, they would have had to decide north or west. And it may have been a decision that was made spontaneously, White Cloud or Mayo, where they had discussed visiting a friend, and that was about 150 miles east. Friends would later say it would have been typical of Brian to suggest at the last second that they change their minds and go north, because he could be fairly impulsive.
So who did they know in Mayo?
They had a friend there they were thinking of visiting.
Just so I know what wavelength we're on. The two guys are driving along. Ostensibly, they're heading west to the cabin.
Uh-huh.
But they decide in the car, or sometime,
Yep.
to not go that way, go kind of the opposite way, and go to Mayo.
Well, it had been a topic of discussion that the cabin in White Cloud was going to be full of a bunch of dirty, gross men. Right? There's going to be like 10, 12 guys in this little cabin. So they had been thinking back and forth, do we really want to go there? And then the friend had offered for them to visit him in Mayo, so I don't know. It wouldn't be really that strange for them to change their minds and go that way, according to their friends and family.
Yeah, and no one will ever know what caused them to choose this direction.
Mm-mm.
But what is known is that White Cloud and the cabin bursting with family and friends was out, and a visit to Mayo was in.
Sure.
So this begins a tragic chain of events.
It really does. So we had some sightings. Larry Barker lived 2 miles northwest of Mayo at 820 Cherry Creek Road. And Larry and his sons were hauling firewood into the house when a dark Ford Bronco pulled into their driveway. Barker never checked the time, but it had been dark for a while, so he guessed that it happened maybe around 8 p.m. By the time he was asked about the Bronco, Barker really couldn't be sure, though, whether it had been Friday, November 22nd, or Saturday, the 23rd. The Bronco just sat there in his driveway, so Larry walked over to the driver's window and asked if he could help. He said there were 2 young guys in the car, and one of them was holding a map and said, "Well, we're kind of confused." So Barker laughed and said, "Well, you got the map upside down." And he reached in and turned the map around so that north would be on the top. "Well, I got directions from the bar," one of them said to him. And he said that he was looking for a road named Camp 10. So apparently their end destination was a cabin off M55, a major east-west road in northern Michigan. Barker tried to talk them through it. So Larry Barker and his 2 boys and the 2 guys in the car chatted for several minutes. And the guys told the Barkers how happy they were to be up north and that they were going to go hunting. They weren't necessarily drunk, Barker said, but he could smell that they had been drinking. He could see a cardboard 12-pack container on their back seat, but he couldn't see how many beers had been taken from it or if it was empty. But they did seem they were a little loose. They definitely had a couple of beers.
Yes, we call that witty and charming.
That's right, the early stages.
Right.
But he said the young men were nice. He talked to them for 12 to 15 minutes. The one with the map rolled up the window and the Bronco backed out of the driveway and headed back down Cherry Creek. So if the Bronco went the correct way, it would have run into Camp 10, which ran north to south, and they would have gone over to the Camp 10 bridge. But if they drove the Bronco the wrong way, it would have run into Mapes Road, which ran parallel to Camp 10, and these were about 3 miles apart. There were a few paved roads in the area, but lots of dirt roads and trails. If the Bronco had gone toward Mapes by mistake and they turned onto it, then they could have driven by Linker's Lost Creek Lodge. But the Barkers didn't watch their tail lights long enough to see which way the Bronco turned. The next time Barker saw them was about a month later when he saw their faces on television. They were missing, So his wife called the police. The owners of Walker's Bar and Bowling Alley in Mayo, Paul and Beverly Pasternak, who lived upstairs, saw the missing hunters twice, once at night and again the next afternoon. And Beverly had talked with them both times. Her daughter Brenda, who worked there, said that she was sure it was Brian and David who had come in there. She remembered them specifically because they started playing pool with a guy who was known as Coke. And I guess his name was Coke not because he was necessarily using cocaine or anything, but he had these thick Coke bottle eyeglasses. And some people would let that bad eyesight fool them and think he was kind of a nerd, but Coke was really a tough guy.
Then there's Danny Welch, who also lived in Mayo. And if you were a frequenter of Walker's Bar, you might think that Welch lived there.
Yeah.
He was an unemployed construction worker who was there 7 nights a week, pretty much every week. Now, David was fairly sure he saw David and Brian. David Welch was fairly sure he had seen David and Brian on Saturday night, November 23rd. Although it could have been Friday the 22nd. About 9:30, 2 young guys walked in. When he was done eating, he walked over and sat down next to them at the bar and introduced himself. They told him their names, David Tyll and Brian Ognjan. They drove up in David's Bronco, they said, and they're staying over at Ma Dieter's place in Luzerne, which was 8 miles to the east. They had rented a room there. Welch asked them why, if they were staying at Ma Dieter's, why were they drinking in Mayo? Looking for women, David told them. Made sense to Welch to come to Mayo. There weren't many women in Mayo, but there sure were more in Mayo than in Luzerne. Welch told them as long as they were there, they should go to the Northwood. He's being a helpful travel guide.
Well, he's hanging out at the bar. He probably talks to a lot of newcomers. It's more interesting than the same old people.
You can get plenty of conversation in a bar.
Yeah, but I think this was a bar that had a lot of regulars. So maybe not that many new people coming by.
Right.
So they said they had a couple of friends that they went to school with that they wouldn't mind visiting, and they asked Welch if he knew either of them, but he didn't. They told him they were supposed to be over in White Cloud to meet up with David's dad there. At some point, unexpectedly, David said, "Hey, wouldn't it be nice to just up and disappear?" He told Welch he would like to just head off to the Bahamas for the winter. So Welch thought maybe they hadn't come to a bad end after all. Maybe they were just a couple of bored city boys who'd run off searching for adventure or for women in the Bahamas. The two told him where they were going to be hunting, and they talked about the Bronco. They sat there drinking and taking turns buying each other drinks. Then Brian got up and said he was going to Northwood.
So Michael Parent was hunting deer in an area known as Multi Hills, which is a few miles south of Mayo, and 2 men approached him in the woods. They'd gotten turned around on the back roads and wanted directions to Mayo. Both of the hunters wore orange blazers. They mentioned they were driving a Bronco, so snow wasn't a concern if they had to take unplowed dirt roads. Over the weekend of November 23rd and 24th, Cynthia Socia was working at Linker's Lost Creek Lodge, where the lodging was upstairs over the one big room that served as a restaurant and bar. Steve Linker and his wife had bought it a few months earlier. Years later, when it was time to promise to tell the truth, Cindy, like Bev Pasternak, was very sure of her dates. They came in on Sunday the 24th, sometime after 5, but earlier than 8. She remembered that it was a quiet night.
Yeah, so the guys had come in and ordered 2 Budweisers. The one named Brian went to the bathroom, and when he came back, David was ready to pay. She collected his money and his $2 tip and went to Linker and told him she didn't want to wait on them. Linker had only owned the place a little more than a month and was eager to keep all the customers he could, so he went over, sat down with them, and had a quiet talk, and they promised to behave. So throughout this whole weekend, we're going to hear from some people who say that these 2 men, David and Brian, were being assholes. We're drunk, we're hitting on women, we're arguing, and we don't know how much of that is true. But Barb Klimek couldn't remember if it was Saturday or Sunday when she saw them. She was a heavy drinker, and she was out at one of the local bars most nights. But Sunday was usually the one night that she would stay home. Her best friend, Ronnie Emery, had stopped by her house just after nightfall, all excited. He had shot the first legal buck of his life, and he wanted to go out and celebrate. So this Ronnie had shot many deer over the years, but this was the first one that he'd shot legally, that he had a license for.
So this is special.
Yeah, it made him feel special. So it could have been a Sunday if that was the day that he shot his buck. They would have made an exception. She would have gone out on a Sunday. She said that she and Ronnie were playing pool and drinking at the bar, and half an hour after they got there, 2 deer hunters came in. She said that right after they arrived, the short one grabbed Barb's ass. "Keep your fucking hands to yourself," she said. 5 minutes later, she was leaning over the table, getting ready to make a shot, when the tall hunter slid past her, rubbing his groin into her butt. She turned and told him where he could shove it and went back to her shot. So she thought most guys would have been embarrassed or left, but not these two. They put 2 quarters on the table and called for the next game. When the game was over, Ronnie and Barb left the table to them and went and sat down. By this time, though, Barb was fuming, and she kept giving the hunters dirty looks. The hunters chatted occasionally with other women or guys, but they really bothered Barb. "Those guys need to get their asses kicked," she said to Ronnie. So Dick Smith didn't remember years later which night of the weekend it was, because they all kind of blended together during deer season. He was a sheriff with the Escota County Sheriff's Department, the kind of a guy who might have let a minor wrongdoing slide if it meant not having to make an arrest or do extra paperwork near the end of his shift. And the way he would recall it years later, he was out with Paul Owens, a conservation officer with the state's Department of Natural Resources. Owens wrote out the citations for hunting violations. So it was about 2 a.m., end of the shift time. Smith was driving, and they were nearing the Camp 10 store. When driving east at M72, a black Bronco pulled out in front of them. So Smith couldn't tell for sure in the dark, but it looked like it had driven right out of the ditch just east of the store. So he thought it's probably a drunk with a 4-wheel drive just out having fun. But it was really late and it was really cold, and he just didn't want to be bothered arresting a drunk driver. But then in the coming weeks, he realized the possible significance of that Bronco. Had it been the missing hunters? Had David Tyll been driving it? Or had someone else been at the wheel? Maybe someone with blood on his hands.
So eventually, a state police detective named Norman Maxwell wrote a report with his interpretation and timeline of events for Brian and David's weekend, November 22nd to 24. It read, Friday, left St. Clair Shores residence for Mayo. Once in Mayo, they stopped at Walker's Bar and Restaurant where they were drinking. Brian left David at Walker's and went to the Northwood Bar. At the Northwood Bar, Brian requested the bartender to pass a note to 2 girls that were in the bar. After the girls left, Brian finished drinking and returned to Walker's Bar, where David was. Now, during this time, David had been cut off from drinking at Walker's Bar due to being intoxicated. So the pair left Walker's Bar, and David left his shirt behind. After leaving Walker's Bar, the pair proceeded out of town and stopped at the Barker residence, where they had obtained directions for Roscommon. Nothing further on Friday. Saturday, nothing reported until they showed up at Walker's Bar mid-afternoon and ordered food. Their location was unknown until they showed up at Linker's Lost Lodge Bar in the evening. Nothing further on Saturday. Sunday, unknown whereabouts until they returned to Linker's Bar in the evening, where they gave the barmaid/waitress, Cindy Sosha, a rough time and spoke with Steve Linker. After leaving Linker's Bar, their whereabouts are unknown.
So they were able to put that together. I don't know how accurate it is, but it's based on witnesses.
Yeah, half the time they couldn't recall the day of the week.
Well, they're all drunk. That's one of the issues. But if there's one thing constant about missing persons reports, it's that the families filling them out never think the police are taking them seriously enough. There is a reason for the police to be more laid back than the loved ones, though, because most people who go missing come back on their own. So they were just gone of their own volition. The Tills and the Ognjans tried to get the police to see David and Brian as missing and endangered. So David was supposedly happily married. He had a good job working for his father-in-law. He had no history of personal or emotional problems. There was no irresponsibility in his past, really at all. So no reason either for Brian to leave. He had a nice girlfriend who was willing to help finance his weekend hunting trips. He owned his own home at a pretty young age. He had a car, a boat, a bank account, and he worked a lot of overtime at a job he really seemed to like. So it just didn't seem to make sense that they would have left on their own. I could see them taking off for a weekend, but not just leaving everything behind permanently.
Yeah, no, I was going to say the same thing.
I mean, everybody says, wouldn't it be nice to run off to the Bahamas in the middle of winter?
If you're in Michigan, that's not a bad idea.
Well, yeah. Well, in any cold place, really.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it sounds like the thinking was that these guys, instead of going hunting, decided to have a weekend on their own.
Yeah, I would buy that for sure. Neither one of them were really hunters anyway.
Right.
So I think the idea of going out, having drinks, meeting some women probably would have been the most likely thing they were doing. But then something clearly happened to them.
Yeah, because they would have planned to be home.
Exactly. So the local police took their reports. The St. Clair Shores police wouldn't let Janice file a report. Longtime girlfriend or not, the one most acquainted with his plans and the first to suspect something was wrong, her opinion really meant nothing to the police. Brian's parents had to come back from Florida to get the paperwork started, and the police promised they would follow up. But they didn't feel like it was cause for alarm, because in their minds, 2 young deer hunters were a day or 2 late coming home, and that happened all the time. No big deal.
No big deal.
But then by the end of the following long Thanksgiving weekend, it was clear that something had to be wrong. Brian and David had talked about visiting their old friend, Dennis Gallup, in Mayo, and they were able to convince an Oscoda County Sheriff's deputy to drive by Gallup's place in Mayo to see if they'd ever showed up there. But Gallup said he hadn't seen or heard anything from Brian or David. So by December 4th, Oscoda was working on the case, and one of their sergeants, Dick Smith, had seen their Bronco, or one just like it, in the parking lot of the Mayo Saloon on Sunday, November 24th. The Oscoda deputies stopped by the Northwood and other stops looking for a pair of young guys up there for the weekend. The local TV station started running reports, and Larry Barker called in to say that he'd given the hunters directions when they stopped at his house on either the 23rd or the 24th. So by December 6th, Oscoda deputies had checked every motel, bar, and restaurant in a wide area. A woman at the Loon Lake Resort said she had seen them, but they hadn't stayed there. They'd been seen in Mayo, at Linker's Lost Creek Lodge, and at Walker's Bar and Bowling Alley. By the 8th, they'd driven down all the obvious trails that hunters in a car might have used while out hunting. But they found nothing. And that same day, Deputy Michael Wesolowski wrote in his daily report, "There were a large amount of fresh snowmobile tracks and other four-wheel drive tracks traveling the trail roads. If these subjects were deceased in this county, this officer or a citizen would have spotted them. Officer feels these subjects are not in this county. Open referral made to Sergeant Richard E. Smith."
Well, Sergeant Smith was Deputy Michael Wesolowski's boss. It wouldn't come out for many years, but eventually state police would refer back to Dick Smith. What they found would shock them. Smith had been dispatched to Linker's Lost Creek Lodge because of a report of a fight in progress. Something about a couple of deer hunters and some locals. According to one witness, he had not completed the response. Smith hated breaking up bar fights. He had allegedly pulled into the parking lot of the Camp 10 store nearby to wait things out. But he did see a Ford Bronco later that night pulling out of a ditch by the store and had not pulled it over. But he did see a Ford Bronco later that night pulling out of a ditch by the store, and he had not pulled it over. He had not wanted his shift to run longer because he had to fill out paperwork on a drunk driver.
Which, can we just say how irresponsible that is? What if they'd gone on to kill someone?
I know. Well, it's end of shift. I'm tired. I want to go home.
Yeah, I get it, but very irresponsible.
Well, and earlier, he didn't want to go in and get into a fight.
No. I mean, he really didn't want to be an officer or whatever he was. No. He did not want the responsibility. I think he just wanted the paycheck.
So no one knows how Brian and David's outcomes might have been different if Smith had gone into the bar or pulled over the Bronco.
Exactly. So it was really, he should have probably lost his job over that. But anyway, meanwhile, stories about the hunters were published in Detroit's big newspapers. And as the story grew, tips began coming in from all over. 2 deer hunters matching Brian and David's description and Broncos of the right year and color were being seen all over the state. But most of the sightings were dead ends. the hunters had not gone to White Cloud or to the Upper Peninsula. Enough consistent and confirmed sightings had come in that made it clear that the two missing friends had gone to Mayo. So, girlfriend Janice Payne and wife Dennis Tyll drove up to look around. They stopped at the sheriff's department and they talked to the sheriff and his deputy. Then they visited Gallup. He hadn't seen them in a year and a half, he said. Brian and David had not left a note at his house saying that they'd stopped by either. So he didn't think all those reports of sightings in and around Mayo could have been true because he thought, well, if they'd come up, they would have visited him.
Yeah,
and
this
they
is
had
a high school friend.
Yes, but maybe they were lost. According to Larry Barker, they were driving around with an upside-down map. And this was before GPS, so I could see that being the case. So Janice and Denise stopped at Linker's and spent the night there. They showed everyone they met photos of Brian and David. No one knew where they were or where they might have gone. So they put up posters in all the bars and restaurants, at the post office, and in supermarkets throughout northern Michigan. And for months, Denise called the sheriff and the Mayo area news people. She kept on doing what she could, but after the first week, she just knew in her heart that David and Brian were dead. It was really the only explanation that made any sense. So now 6 months went by. The Troy police made periodic inquiries, as did the St. Clair Shores police. Oscoda deputies followed leads, but they all went nowhere. Oscoda County Sheriff Michael Larison hung photos of David and Brian on the walls of his department, just as a reminder to be on the lookout for them. But those papers would just hang there for 18 years. So let's go back to May 22nd, 1986.
Okay.
So this was a painfully long time to Brian and David's families, but the Michigan State Police took over the case at that point. Detective Sergeant Norman Maxwell was asked to contact the Troy and St. Clair Shores Police to get copies of their files. And he was also told to check with some out-of-state police agencies and other police all around the state.
So St. Clair Shores report was brief. Case number 85-30181. Brian George Ognjan, white male, born 1/16/58. He had 2 registered weapons, a .357 caliber revolver and a .22 caliber pistol. Both were found in his home in St. Clair Shores. He had gone missing on November 22, 1985. Police Detective Maxwell checked to make sure both men were in the Computerized Law Enforcement Intelligence Network. That's LEIN. This is a system that was available to police nationwide, and both men were on it. David Tyll, 6'2", 180 pounds, brown hair, brown eyes. Brian Ognjan, 5'8", 175, sandy brown hair, brown eyes. David Till's 1980 black Bronco was there too. Michigan plate 447HRZ, set to expire August 21st, 1986. A law enforcement intelligence network check turned up nothing new by any U.S. or Canadian agency.
Yeah, now the check didn't just look for activity by the missing man that had run afoul of the law. It showed if any of the local agencies had been actively using the computer network to search for the men. The St. Joseph County Sheriff's Department had checked in several times, but that really was about it. The other departments hadn't followed up. There was one hit from Oklahoma. Maxwell called and was told that the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation had seen an earlier notice and had wanted to cross-reference the descriptions against their own unidentified persons file, but nothing had matched. So the missing hunters had been assigned Interpol case number 860607283, and it was now officially an international mystery. Maxwell would work Canada and Mexico himself, looking for leads on the Bronco or the men. He called investigators with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan to see if either man had used his insurance since November 22nd. Now, David Tyll was apparently very healthy. He had last used his in July of 1985 for outpatient care for a brief illness, but neither of them had used their insurance since the time they went missing. Maxwell and a Troy officer interviewed Denise Tyll at work in Troy, and she told them that David was supposed to have gone hunting the opening weekend on November 15th instead of the 22nd, but she'd had an office party that Saturday, and he had decided to go with her to that instead. She was able to confirm the timeline she'd given earlier of he and Brian leaving Friday afternoon, not coming home Sunday night, and her calling his family in a panic. But there was something that raised one of Maxwell's eyebrows, as well as other investigators, because Denise was already living with a new boyfriend, Roger Dudley, the brother of a good girlfriend. So she'd met him a month or so after David went missing, and then she'd moved in with him 2 months later. Seems awfully fast.
Doesn't it?
It really does. So she told them that she and David had been separated once before for about 5 months, 3 years earlier. She didn't think David had dated anyone, but she had dated around and had even started to get serious with someone. So that was her reasoning. The marriage wasn't good to begin with, I guess.
She had even filed for divorce, but had decided to try to fix her marriage. And they had fixed it, she said. They'd gotten along fine, and she didn't want to divorce him. But now she and Roger were talking about getting married next spring.
Well, another thing raised an eyebrow as well. On her own, without being asked, Denise said she had not checked out whether David or Brian were gay, that David had never showed any signs, but that Brian had never really dated much until he met Janice. So Maxwell noted in his report, underlining that Denise had voluntarily advised that she hadn't asked him if he was gay. It just seemed like a weird thing to bring up.
Doesn't it?
Now, she did say that David had hung around 3 bars on 7 Mile Road, but had lessened his bar time when he got arrested for a DUI back when they were separated.
They interviewed her father and David's boss, Dennis Wygocki, at DeLand Manufacturing in Madison Heights. He confirmed he'd given David Friday off so he could get an early start, and that his daughter had called him Monday morning, hoping that he had given David Monday off too.
Maxwell interviewed David's parents, Arthur and Catherine Tyll. They really didn't appreciate one line of questioning, but it had to be ruled out. Had Brian and David had a romantic relationship and just decided to run off together? But they weren't the type, the Tills insisted. They knew Brian was close to his parents and David was close to them, and neither was the type to run off with another woman either. So Brian's girlfriend, Janice Payne, was very cooperative, but she didn't have much to add either. Then there was a disturbing development. On July 15, 1986, Maxwell wrote in a report that Troy Detective Steele had called him to tell him that Denise had been advised by her attorney not to answer any more questions. He noted that he and Steele were about to interview Brian's old girlfriend Janice and would see if the same attitude was applied to her. So Denise was just kind of hard to figure out, living with a new boyfriend who she met right after her husband went missing, really. Then she goes and gets an attorney. She talked to them, but now she won't talk to them anymore. If she was just the innocent wife of a missing man, why would she feel that she needs an attorney? It could be innocent, but it could be not innocent.
Well,
it's a little
raises
weird.
Some red flags.
It kind of does.
In January 1987, Maxwell checked with the Troy police one more time to see if they had heard anything, and if not, he was to mark the case closed. On January 23rd, Maxwell wrote a brief report. He had talked to Detective Steele, and there was nothing new. The report read, "Advised Detective Steele that this complaint was going to be closed at this time. Advised Detective Steele that this complaint was going to be closed at this time. However, it will be reopened at a later date if further leads develop. Steele advised that his police department was going to go ahead and close their complaint also, and will wait for further leads. Complaint status, closed at this time, to be reopened if further leads develop."
They like saying if further leads develop, don't they? So then, February 22nd, 1988, the case was reopened. An elderly woman from the northeast Michigan town of Prudenville had been asking about the investigation, who was in charge of it, and what she should do if she had any helpful information. So she was referred to Detective Sergeant Curtis Schramm, who had recently taken over the closed case from Detective Maxwell. So this woman's name was Genevieve Yocklin, and she was a deer hunter. She actually had not missed a season in the past 30 years. She told Detective Schramm that about 9:30 a.m. on November 23, 1985, she and her husband had gone into the woods in Roscommon County. They had seen a black Ford Bronco on the shoulder, but no one was in or around it. Then, when they left the woods about 5 p.m., the Bronco was still there. But this time there were 2 men at the front of the vehicle and a third man standing near the rear. So she and her husband did look at the men, but then they kept walking. So they hadn't thought much about it, but then in the spring of 1986, She saw pictures of a man who was wanted for shooting and killing a sheriff's deputy who had picked him up while hitchhiking. She couldn't remember his first name, but his last name was Hannah, and she recognized him as one of the guys who had been at the Bronco. So right after she had seen Hannah's picture, she'd seen the missing photos of Brian and David. And they were the two men, she said, who she'd seen with Hannah near the Bronco. Her description of them was really excellent. She said she'd been able to keep them fresh in her mind because at the time she thought the three of them together looked out of place because two of them were dressed up like hunters. But Hannah was wearing a blue turtleneck sweater, fatigue pants, and lace-up boots. But wait, it gets better. Her husband always slept with the window open, and early in the morning of November 24th at about 12:30 or 1 a.m., they heard 2 shots from a high-powered rifle coming from Lake St. James, and she knew that Hannah had a cabin on the lake. So Jacqueline believed that Hannah had shot the hunters and that their bodies and the Bronco could be found somewhere near that lake. But then why hadn't she said something earlier? Well, she said that since her husband's death the year before, it had bothered her that she might know something about the missing deer hunters that maybe could help solve the case. Also, she'd gone to the Houghton State Police Post when she'd seen the missing posters 1 year earlier. She couldn't remember who she'd talked to there, but she said that the guy didn't seem to take her seriously and she'd never heard back from them. So to Schramm's surprise, some of this story did check out. There had been a guy named Hannah whose first name was Joel, and he had shot an Otsego County deputy named Carl Darling Jr. Then later, he'd been shot and killed after trying to attack 2 police officers in Georgia with a pitchfork.
Jeez.
So Hannah did live on a lake, but it was Lake George, which was nowhere close to the Jacquelines. It was way out of hearing range for any gunshots. So 2 state police detectives at the Houghton Post had interviewed her in person, and back then she hadn't seemed so sure of herself. And she couldn't positively ID any of the 3 men from photos that were shown to her. So even though this didn't really check out fully, Detective Schramm kept the case open at that point.
Yeah, there's enough stuff that could be proven. So things in the investigation looked up on December 8, 1988, when 18 police officers from a variety of jurisdictions had a meeting about the case. The size of the gathering and the jurisdictions involved were proof that Detective Schramm held out hope that new information would move the case forward. Richard Anderson of the Washtenaw County Auto Theft Unit in Ann Arbor began the meeting. He had an informant who claimed that he had overheard in a bar in Wixom that J.R. Duval had killed the 2 hunters and buried them in the woods. The bar was O'Shea's Tavern. Duval was heard saying that he'd gotten into a fight in a bar, taken the hunters outside, and shot them. Anderson had reason to believe that the Bronco had ended up in the possession of a South Lyon resident. Your father?
Maybe that's where my dad lives.
He'd been conducting surveillance of the house in October and saw the Bronco, which had been converted into a short bed pickup.
Yeah, my dad wouldn't do that. He's not very handy with cars and stuff.
No. This new pickup had a wrong plate on it.
Yeah, it did.
So the South Lyon guy had gotten the Bronco from a well-known guy up in the northern Michigan village of Kalkaska, who specialized in changing vehicle identification numbers or switching plates. The Kalkaska guy was a good friend of J.R. Duval.
So this is where we might be getting somewhere with the Duval brothers. Detective Maxwell did background checks on both J.R. Duval and his brother, Coco Duval, real name Donald Dean Duval. They were both considered extremely violent. J.R. was living in South Branch, and Coco was living with J.R. Now detectives thought they might be making some real progress on the case. J.R. and Coco Duval were very well known. They were 2 tough guys and leaders in a family of 7 brothers. The family patriarch was Raymond Duval Sr., who died in prison. The matriarch was Shirley. J.R. had J.R. tattooed on his left arm, and Coco had a tattoo that said Coke on his right arm. Now remember that witness had said that they were hanging out with a guy known by the name of Coke.
Yep.
The Duvals were really legends up north and in the tough town of Monroe, which was down near the Toledo border along the Detroit River. As kids, they spent most of their time in Monroe, and their classmates' parents called them the Monroe Mafia. So J.R. got married as a teen to a girl named Kate, and he was sent to Vietnam. But he didn't wait to get to Vietnam to shoot anyone. When he was just 13, Raymond Sr. started stabbing his wife, so J.R. shot his father with a .22. Both his father and mother survived. Police decided that J.R. had acted in self-defense, so he didn't get in trouble for that. And before he stabbed his wife, Ray Sr. was known as beating her regularly. So J.R. finished 4 years as a military policeman, something law enforcement officers would later find quite ironic. Late in the 1970s, after giving birth to 2 sons, Kate divorced him. And her sister Georgia, who'd married Coco, said J.R. was a different person when he came home from Vietnam. Well, that's not really unusual, unfortunately. But Georgia married Coco in 1970, and she divorced him 6 years later. He had broken her jaw the year they got married, and her nose later. So the jaw wasn't his fault, he said. He was trying to hit her uncle, and she just got in the way. Yep. So, that kind of shit happens.
That happens.
It happens. So as adults, some of the Duvalls lived up north year-round. Others spent their winters in Monroe. J.R. and Coco would steal cars, chop them into parts, and then sell them in a day. They could track deer and run trap lines, and they knew where the best hardwood was to chainsaw into firewood. They were also good mechanics, roofers, welders, and electricians who thought nothing of climbing a consumer's power pole and rigging up a line to get free electricity down to their houses. So when asked years later what he did for a living in the 1980s, Coco would answer, firewood and welfare.
Yes, sir.
So interesting family for sure.
Oh, that's an understatement. But they weren't above doing legitimate work when needed. They'd paint the occasional barn, put in fence posts for money. They had re-roofed some restaurants in the area. J.R. had bartended at Timber's Steakhouse in South Branch, where he was also a very skilled bouncer. Coco had a tow truck for years down in Monroe, and he fought the city for years over running his business out of his home. At the time the police task force met up, both Coco and J.R. were working at the Union 76 gas station. Coco's current live-in girlfriend, Connie Sundberg, worked there too.
Yeah, one time during one of her breakups with Coco, Connie agreed to a date with the son of a local deputy sheriff. And when this guy came by to pick her up, a couple of the Duvalls and one of their friends jumped him. One of their friends had a metal pipe and broke this man's skull. But for some reason, no charges were ever filed. Sheriff deputy or not, everyone had to be careful when it came to the Duvalls. Locals, including law enforcement, knew to avoid eye contact and keep your voice down with the Duvalls until you could judge the mood or level of intoxication that they were in. Sheriff Doug Ellinger said if you pulled one of them over for something, you knew to call for backup first. This was a big family with just the siblings, but it was really huge when you brought in all the first cousins, second cousins, children, wives, ex-wives, girlfriends, and ex-girlfriends. It was the kind of family that, when a cousin was asked if he had a cousin on the mom's side or the dad's side, he might honestly be able to answer both. So it's a deliverance type situation.
Seems to be. Then on December 15th, 1988, Detective Schramm and a state police detective for the Western Wayne County Auto Theft Unit met with Detective Anderson's informant. Things were not as clear as they had hoped. This man hadn't overheard J.R. confess to anything. He knew the Duvalls, but he'd never seen them carry guns or knives. There was the Ford Bronco and a retag man, and a guy in South Lyon he had sold the Bronco to. The Bronco had extensive work done to it. The wheels were changed. It was painted a different color, and it was converted to a pickup.
Yeah, but that part of the story began to break down, too. The guy who'd bought the Bronco lived in South Lyon with his employer. The 2 officers interviewed the employer, who told them that the South Lyon man had bought the Bronco from a guy up north for $1,300, and that he had rebuilt the motor. As for the paint job, he had primed it and painted it a different color, but then he repainted it the original silver. And he'd only had it for a month, and then he'd resold it for $3,600. So a state police detective contacted the retag man's wife. She had a pink copy of the title showing that it had been purchased from Boyce Motor Sales, a purchase that was confirmed by Boyce. So it seemed that the purchase was legitimate. Both Duvalls had extensive criminal histories, though, so investigators believed that no information would be gained by interviewing them. They were just too street smart, too used to dealing with the authorities.
Yeah. Plus they're scary.
Scary guys, yeah. I think even a lot of the police were afraid of them.
So the retag man's now off the hook. It was the wrong Bronco. But they had 2 names of known bad guys now, and that was something. Just because they weren't known to go around shooting people with guns or stabbing them with knives did not mean they were innocent.
No, they were violent men.
On August 14th, Detective Schramm re-interviewed Detective Anderson's informant. The story had a big change from the last time he told it in December. This time, he said he'd been in O'Shea's Tavern in Wixom about 2 years earlier, and he had heard J.R. telling family members about he and his brother Coco getting into a fight with 2 deer hunters outside a bar and killing them. He didn't know where the bar was or what the Duvalls had used, but since then he'd heard other family members telling variations of the story.
Right, so the informant told them that they should talk to a guy named Raymond Metcalf, who lived up in Kalkaska. On September 7th, 3 detectives met with Metcalf. He told them he knew J.R. and Coco well, but had had nothing to do with them in about 15 years. So he said he knew nothing about any 1980 Ford Bronco. Debbie, a cousin of the Duvalls, remembered the incident and hadn't taken him seriously. Coco Duvall was very close with her sister, Susan Yonkin, who lived down in Florida. So she said if anyone knew anything, it would be Susan. A couple of days later, Debbie called Detective Schramm. She'd called her sister in Florida, saying her kids had been arguing about details of something they'd heard about a while back. Something about J.R. and Coco feeding some guys to pigs. What'd she know about it? Was it true? And Susan had told her that it was true. So the story J.R. had told was that 3 or 4 years ago he'd gotten drunk at some bar and was beaten up by 5 guys. J.R. had left and come back with Coco and someone else. Only 2 of the guys who'd beaten him up were still in the bar. They dragged them outside, beat them up, killed them, and fed them to pigs. She didn't know what bar or what town, though. No one had reported seeing David Tyll or Brian Ognjan in any group of 5. So maybe the Duvalls had killed some other guys that no one even knew about. But on September 11th, detectives met with a reporter from the Detroit Free Press, as well as David and Brian's family members. A flyer was made up offering a reward of $15,000 for information that would lead to the location of David or Brian. So the flyers were being sent to state police posts, as well as to the Monroe Police Department. The flyers didn't mention J.R. or Coco, but the police were hoping they would hear from people who had heard them bragging about the killing.
State police tracked down J.R.'s ex-girlfriend, Donna Sundberg, on September 23rd. She said that right after the Labor Day weekend, J.R.'s mother's boyfriend, James McBee, had come by looking for J.R. He wanted to warn J.R. that his brother had just called to warn the family that police in Monroe were asking questions about the missing deer hunters. A couple of other buddies stopped by, she said, and they talked about the hunters and the renewed investigation.
Yeah, at one point, J.R. made up an excuse to get Donna to go to the store so they could talk more freely. Still, she'd heard a lot that she was happy to share. And a day or 2 later, while lying in bed together, Donna said she'd joked with J.R. You know, pigs don't eat skulls. And he had said, if you don't shut up, I'll feed you to the pigs. What a charmer.
Isn't it?
I can't believe she broke up with him. What was she thinking? He seems like such a catch. On September 25th, detectives interviewed Sharon Russo. She had moved in with Rex in 1981, and she'd lived in a house with Rex, J.R., and the various kids that the women there had had by their boyfriends. She and Rex had broken up the previous year after Rex had been sentenced to 36 to 42 months in prison for criminal sexual misconduct with a 15-year-old girl. Now, Sharon said she'd been working at Timber's Steakhouse in 1985. And that year, like all others, the Duvalls and many of their friends were there for deer season, and they were drinking heavily every day. She said she had no direct knowledge of the missing hunters, but she had heard about the brothers cutting up cars and disposing of parts. It was common knowledge, she said, that with J.R.'s knowledge of the local woods and swamps, He had no problem knowing where to hide things. Over the years, she had kept pigs out behind her house, and in the mid-1980s, she'd had 3 sows that had at least 3 litters of pigs. The Duvals were always out poaching deer, and they'd feed the remains to the pigs. Stolen cars were always being cut up there too, she said. She remembered parts being buried in a hole behind their trailer, and she remembered them once setting fire to a car and then pushing it into a river. So definitely some shady business.
Yeah, we keep getting more and more people saying that these are bad guys.
Oh, for sure, yes.
So the detectives called Susan Yonkin down in Kissimmee, Florida. She told them Coco had told her about the fight, and it was revenge for a beating suffered by JR, but that no one had gotten killed. She'd been at O'Shea's too, and hadn't heard any talk about murders or pigs. Her husband said he'd heard rumors about the brothers killing some hunters, but didn't know anyone who'd have direct knowledge.
Yes, so a grand jury was put together in Oakland County concerning the missing hunters for a 6-month term, and 36 witnesses testified. Connie Sundberg said Coco had drunkenly told her one night, "We killed them." Rocky Harmon said he'd overheard JR and Coco tell family members at O'Shea's that they had killed the hunters. Rodney Sundberg said that JR had said at a party that a good way to get rid of bodies was to feed them to pigs. Lonnie McMullen said he'd heard from 2 of JR's friends that JR had admitted killing the hunters to them. Donna Sundberg said JR had threatened to feed her to the pigs when she asked him what he and his friends had been saying one night about the hunters. Eileen Seitz, another of JR's ex-girlfriends, said she'd seen Randy Duval driving a Bronco the weekend the hunters disappeared. Once she heard JR and Coco talking, and one of them said, "I know we're going to get caught." Also, Gerald Dewar said Rex had once told him, "Wouldn't it be something to feed people to pigs?" And another friend, Larry Asher, said Coco had told him once that JR had been beaten up by 5 guys, but that Coco and JR had later jumped the 2 of them and beaten them to death, then chopped one of them up and fed them to the hogs. And then another time, Coco said if they went fishing in a particular spot, they would be near the Bronco. So a lot of kind of rumors, hearsay, a lot of that going on.
Yeah, but they're all telling a pretty consistent story.
Right, and the grand jury believed a lot of it.
Then the case seemed to be going cold again when police got a call back from a message they'd left for a woman named Ruth Fawcett. This was in March of 1999. Ruth told them that she had a friend named Barb Klimek, a one-time heavy drinker.
Yeah, remember we talked about her.
We did. She's the one that had gotten her ass slapped.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Barb said during one of her binges, she had confided to Fawcett that she knew more about the lost hunters than anyone would believe. Barb had told her she was in a bar called something like Sky Ranch Lost Creek when there was a confrontation between some locals and some hunters. There was a fight, so she went home and later heard some noises in the woods by her house. It sounded like fighting and arguing. Then, soon after, a couple guys showed up at her door and told her, "Keep your mouth shut. You didn't see anything. We know how to take care of you. Pigs need to eat too." Barb told Fawcett that these were bad characters, capable of killing at any time, and that she'd never cooperate with the police because of fear of retaliation.
Well, something about this tip did seem more believable than the others. There were a lot of details. The next night, a detective drove to Mayo and started knocking on doors, asking if there was a Barb living there. So there weren't many houses near the intersection of M72 and Mapes where Fawcett thought Barb was living. He didn't have any luck on the evening of the 4th, but then on Friday, March 5th, he pulled into a long driveway on Mapes Road, and a woman opened the door and looked out. He introduced himself and told her he was there about the missing deer hunters. And he asked, "Are you Barb Klimek?" And the woman actually flinched. Then she started shaking so much that it seemed like she might be having a seizure. "You're going to get me killed," she said, and she pushed her door shut. But the detective was able to stop her from shutting it all the way by putting his foot in the door, and he asked her if he could come in. He told her he wasn't in uniform and he wasn't driving a marked car, so she wasn't in danger. She was still very hesitant, but the detective managed to get inside. She was still shaking, and then she started crying. "You're going to get me killed," she told him. He told her he had leads and just needed to know if he was on the right track. "I'm going to solve this if it takes the rest of my life," he told her. And she could tell, looking at his face and hearing his voice, that he was serious about this. "I didn't like those deer hunters much," Barb said. "They deserved to get their asses kicked, but they didn't deserve to get killed." And then she started crying again. So Klimek was her married name, she told them, but now she went by Boudreaux. She didn't want to talk, but finally she said, "You find Kim. If she'll talk, so will I." Kim apparently had been a barmaid at Linker's Lost Creek Lodge up the road, she said, and Kim knew things. But then Barb started telling her story. So she started talking about the night at Linker's. "One of them grabbed me on my ass when I was playing pool. I told them to knock off their shit. Showed photos of Brian and David. She said that David was the one who had grabbed her. There had been almost instant tension when the Duvalls arrived, like they'd met earlier and they already had bad blood. She'd approached the Duvalls' table and said something about the hunters. One of the Duvalls said that they were going to teach them a lesson. So she'd been there with her buddy Ronnie Emery. He was an old friend of hers who was now dead. She said it was kind of a suicide. He'd supposedly gotten drunk and crawled out on the highway and got his head run over. So clearly she thinks this may have been the work of the Duvalls. Back in 1995, he'd been run over by a 1990 Chevy pickup. Though she was suspicious it might have been something else, like maybe a murder made to look like suicide, she'd kept quiet. Anyway, about Linker, she said that she'd been in there with Ron, and there was talk about getting dope. The hunters were looking to score. The Duvalls were trying to line something up from a 50-year-old couple who lived down the road and sold pot. She thought the Duvalls might be trying to lure the hunters outside on the pretext of getting them dope so then they could attack them. Then one of the Duvalls made a call to a pig farmer in South Branch, Boudreaux said, and a brief time later, friends of the Duvalls showed up. The brothers or their friends brought her a six-pack and told her to leave. "You didn't see anything and you don't know nothing," they said. So she left and drove down Mapes Road to her home, which was less than a mile away. A little bit later, she heard screaming coming from the woods between her house and the bar, and she said it was so loud she could hear it over her TV. She knew that the hunters were going to get their asses kicked and figured they deserved it, but she didn't know they were going to be killed. So she said a little while later the noises stopped, and then a little while after that there was a knock at her door. It was the Duvalls. "You didn't see anything and you don't know anything," she quoted them saying. "If you ever open your mouth, you'll be killed. Pigs gotta eat too." Since then, every once in a while, one of the Duvalls would stop by and remind her, she said, "You didn't see anything and you don't know anything, or else." So speaking to the detective, she said, "You have no idea what trouble I'm in. They will kill me and my grandchildren." So Boudreaux was extremely upset. The detective left, telling her he would be back in touch if he could find Kim and see what she had to say.
But Boudreaux was very worried about what she knew and what the Duvalls might do to her and her family. She showed up at the Oscoda County Sheriff's Department, crying, wanting to talk. She reported that she and a friend had been at the bar on the night of David and Brian's disappearances. She had seen them, J.R. and Coco, exchange words there. She said that she and her friend later witnessed J.R. and Coco attack David and Brian and then beat them to death with an aluminum baseball bat in a field near her home. She said that they then placed the bodies in their Ford Bronco and drove away.
So she didn't come forward with what she knew until 2003 because of her fear of the Duvalls. Several other witnesses reported that J.R. and Coco bragged about killing David and Brian, cutting their bodies up and feeding their remains to their pigs. These witnesses were also threatened into silence for years. Another witness, J.R.'s son's girlfriend, also came forward in 2003, and she said that J.R. had bragged to her that he and Coco had killed David and Brian over a dispute about a deer. He'd also told her that he had put the bodies through a wood chipper and fed the remains to the pigs. Then he threatened to do the same to her if she left his son. Then another witness, Coco's girlfriend at the time, said that in 1986 he confessed to killing David and Brian. He then beat her, she said, and threatened to kill her if she told anyone. She and two other witnesses also said that another Duvall brother, Rex, was driving David's Bronco a few days after his and Brian's murders.
So J.R. was arrested by state police on a warrant out of Alcona County for failure to pay child support. The arrest was made in part to pressure him into taking a lie detector test, which he agreed to. He said he was probably living in Curtisville in 1985, but that when the hunters had gone missing, he was camped out in the woods. He didn't know about any missing hunters, he said, and he didn't know about any Bronco. I know nothing.
Yep.
Lieutenant Charles Allen administered the lie detector test, and he determined that J.R. was lying. He believed J.R. was either directly responsible or at least involved.
Yeah, a couple of weeks later, detectives interviewed Coco Duvall. He'd been living out on East County Line Road in South Branch in 1985, he said. He was aware of the accusations, but said he was in no way responsible and did not know anything, and he declined to take a polygraph. So then detectives decided to talk to Connie Sundberg. Her name had kept coming up as someone who had known more than she was saying. She and her boyfriend were staying at the Best Western Hotel while he was on a construction job, and she recounted her years as Coco's girlfriend. They'd met during the deer season of 1979 when she was 16 and Coco was 27. She'd moved in with Coco in Monroe in January of 1980. Then in June, they'd moved back north to the South Branch area, and that's where they remained until that May. That's when she met and took off with her new boyfriend, John Brown. She said she never heard about them feeding any people to their pigs, but it wouldn't have surprised her. She said that J.R. and Coco were both alcoholics. Coco would get drunk and beat Connie up and then pass out. J.R. was a very heavy drug user, too, but Coco thought he'd had a heart attack once and was too afraid to use drugs anymore. The Duvalls, she said, were in many bar fights over the years, usually over at Timbers. They always fought together and helped each other out, too. So on May 13th, 2003, a day that state police had been working toward for more than 17 years, warrants were issued for the arrests of J.R. Wilbur Duvall, Jr., 52 years old, and Donald Dean Duvall, 51 years old, for the murders of David Tyll and Brian Ognjan. The arrests were planned to be made simultaneously in two different locations at 5 a.m. on the 14th, but that didn't work out. One of J.R.'s neighbors in a heavily wooded area had been keeping watch on him for the police, and he called the police and told them that it looked like J.R. was getting ready to flee. He and his girlfriend were loading stuff into the trunk of his car, so the police needed to move ASAP. So J.R. was arrested that same day, and at 7:20, Coco was arrested without incident in the garage of his house. The brothers were arraigned before a county circuit judge, who granted up to $7,500 to help court-appointed attorney Scott Williams prepare J.R.'s case. The money would go, said the attorney, to an investigator to track down witnesses and leads from the files that had been assembled by the police over close to 2 decades now. But they didn't grant any money to Donald's defense. For some reason, the Duvall family was paying for his attorney and not for J.R.'s. So J.R. was basically on his own.
Now, the prosecution had one eyewitness, and that eyewitness was not a prosecutor's dream.
Oh, far from it. But this is what we're dealing with.
Play the game as it's played.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to work with what you have.
Barb Boudreaux was one of the most impeachable witnesses you will ever see. She was an admitted partier who rarely missed a night at the bar throughout the 1980s.
Well, also, there really weren't any guarantees that Boudreaux would testify. She could back out. There was always the chance that fear would get the best of her. She had been threatened by these people who she knew were killers. If what she said was true, she had to be terrified of them.
Absolutely.
But the drama really started before Boudreaux could even be sworn in. She got 3 steps into the courtroom with a TV camera aiming at her. Then she looked at Coco and said, "I can't do this." She started crying and ran back out into the hallway. So a detective was able to finally talk her into going back in, and later she'd say she was sure that Coco had been about to jump over the railing at her and was going to try and kill her right then and there. Meanwhile, the judge called a recess and invited the attorneys into his chambers. He said, "I think you guys shot her a look," to the defense. The prosecution accused Coco Duval of saying or doing something. So they were warned, and then they all went back into the courtroom. But Boudreaux did okay. She was feisty, weepy, shaky, and she repeatedly was telling the room she was scared for her life. She told everyone about the night of drinking at Linker's and how she had sensed trouble when the Duvals walked in. She also talked about how the Hunters had rubbed up against her at the pool table and grabbed her by her rear end and made fools of themselves. She talked about how the Duvals had come in and seemed to hone in on the two. "If you've ever been in a bar, you can tell when there's going to be trouble," she said. And she knew because she'd spent a fair amount of time in bars.
And had seen a fair amount of trouble.
She had, so that actually made her more believable. She told the jury about the six-pack and the noises she'd heard outside of her home. Boudreaux and her friend Ronnie Emery had run down the trail to a clearing that had been lit by the headlights of the Bronco and a pickup truck, and they had seen 7 men, 2 of them the Hunters. The tall one was prone, trying to get up to his knees and begging for his life. Then they swung the bat at him, and it sounded like if you dropped a pumpkin, and then there was just blood everywhere, she said. Everyone in the court was staring at her transfixed, with the exception of the Duvals, who were looking down. Coco had swung that bat, she said, and while he was swinging, JR was kicking and punching David Tyll. 2 other people were holding Brian. He broke away and ran, and they pulled him back, and he said, "My God, you're killing my friend." Then he collapsed, and then they started laughing because he peed himself. "My God, they were killing him," said Boudreaux, "and no one deserves to die that way." So even though she was a little bit shaky as a witness, she did tell a very compelling story.
Yes, she did.
Yeah.
So both defendants first challenged the testimony of Michigan State Police Detective Sergeant Robert Lesniewski concerning his contacts with Barbara Boudreaux. In a 1999 interview at her home, Boudreaux provided details about this crime, but refused to say that she witnessed the killings. She instead claimed that her deceased friend had witnessed the crime. She continued to deny being an eyewitness during part of a later interview done under an investigative subpoena. But after a break in the investigative subpoena proceedings, where she talked more, Boudreaux admitted having seen the killings. During the trial, Boudreaux testified about what she witnessed, and also about her initial reluctance to testify.
Well, I think anyone would understand why she'd be reluctant.
Yeah.
They're scary people. And if she had actually seen them do that, that would be terrifying.
Wouldn't it?
It really would. So over objection, the prosecutor presented the detective's testimony about Boudreaux's lack of composure during the initial and later interview, her statements that she was afraid to testify about what she'd seen, and her admission that she had witnessed these killings. Now, most defendants don't testify in their murder trial, but both of the Duvals testified. Coco went first, calmly and quietly testifying that he couldn't remember after all those years where he'd been that weekend. Asked what he was doing on Thanksgiving, he said, probably eating a turkey. Asked about the weekend before, he answered, who knows? And he claimed that any pigs he'd ever had were fed fruit and vegetables, never meat. So right there, they should have said, case closed, you can go home.
Yep.
Right?
That's right.
So there'd been a lot of testimony, rumors, and overheard conversations. But one thing was pretty clear to everyone. If the jury didn't believe Barb Boudreaux, everything else was kind of meaningless. The case would be busted. But then even if the jury did believe her testimony that there'd been a fight in a clearing down from her house, and that she had witnessed unspeakable brutality and hadn't spoken about it for many years, they could still have enough reasonable doubt to come back with a not guilty verdict. Because it was dark, she was drunk, there were guys with beards and long hair at a time when a lot of Northwood guys wore their hair long and didn't shave. Sure, she might have witnessed 2 murders, but that didn't necessarily mean that she was right about the killers being the Duvals. There had been a lot of damning testimony against JR and Coco. But there'd been a lot of contradictory testimony, too. The prosecution made a big deal about that altercation at Linker's, but there had been testimony about several different levels of arguments. Because Barb first told police that it had to be on a Saturday night because she didn't go out partying on Sundays because she worked on Mondays. And Saturday was the day her buddy had shot his first legal buck. She also remembered she'd worked that day, and she normally didn't work Sundays. But too many other people had seen the hunters in other places Saturday night to match them being at Linker's too that night. So if they had gotten into a fight with the Duvalls, it would have had to have been on Sunday.
Jury deliberation started at 2:54 p.m., and they came back with a verdict at 5 p.m., 2 hours of deliberation.
Yeah, not much.
Both Duvalls were found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Each one was sentenced to life in prison, and each has exhausted all their appeals. David Tyll's 1980 Ford Bronco has never been found. 3 people say they saw another Duval brother, Rex, driving the vehicle for a few days after the men's disappearance. Another Duval brother, Kenny, told police he had scrapped the Bronco and sold it for parts, but insists he did not participate in the murders.
Well, someone had to participate in the murders with them if there'd been 7 people there, like Barb said.
Yeah, maybe 5 of their buddies went home.
No, she'd seen them in the clearing when the killing happened, she said.
It strikes me that the Duvalls would back up. Though Kenny Duval claimed he did not help dispose of David and Brian's remains and did not know what happened to them.
Yeah, so we really still, they've not been found and their vehicle's not been found. So even though it is a solved case technically because people were convicted for it, to me it seems like there were other people involved who have not been convicted. That certainly seems true.
Yeah.
And the families would probably like their bodies to be found. So if you do have any information on the possible location of their remains, please contact the St. Clair Shores, Michigan Police Department. And their number is 586-445-5305. So kind of a solved case, but I bet it's not completely satisfying to their families.
I wouldn't think.
No. Okay, well, Dickie has just brought in some feedback for us. So I'd like to give a little reminder before we move on. We do have a premium option of TCB where you can get early, ad-free, and bonus shows. If this interests you, we appreciate your support. And you can go to tiegrabber.com/subscribe, or you can also go to patreon.com/tiegrabber for the same benefits. Other ways to support the show are to give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. So if you decide to support the show and get the ad-free and bonus episodes, we also send you a gift. We send out snifters to drink your beer in, magnets, bottle openers. We have all kinds of swag that we'd be happy to send you, and we always write a personalized thank you note as well. If you have feedback or case suggestions for us to cover on an upcoming show, you can send an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com, and voicemails can be sent by clicking on the voicemail link in our show notes or going straight to our website and recording from there. We do love to get feedback.
It's time for listener feedback.
Let's start today's feedback with a voicemail from Jesse. That's Jesse with an I.
Hey, Jill and Dick. My name is Jessie from Atlanta, Georgia, and I have been listening to you guys since 2016, so I feel like y'all are old friends to me now. I had a baby a few months after y'all started the podcast, so you've been in my earbuds through sitting up with a sick child or going on road trips or doing work tasks, and so I'm very grateful for y'all. And I wanted to mention that if you go on the Atlanta Police Department's website, atlantapd.org, they have lists of cold cases there. If anyone's local to the area, you might know something and be able to help out. And I would love to hear y'all cover a cold case too. You put so much research into your episodes, and I think you'd be able to have some great insight as to what happened on some of these cold cases. And as far as Atlanta beer, I mean breweries as far as the eye could see. So there's a lot for Dick to talk about too. All right, thanks y'all so much. Have a great day.
So there's a nice enthusiastic listener.
Yeah, thanks, Jessie. I think it's great that she's been listening for so long, like before she had her baby, and now her baby's what, like 8 years old?
She's one of the OGs.
Yeah, she's an OG, so that's incredible. Thank you so much. We also love Atlanta, one of our favorite places to visit. Lots of beer there. Lots of vegan food there that I like too.
Yes, good place.
Yeah, it's a great place to visit, so I will definitely look it up. I know more and more people want us to do unsolved cases. which it's hard to find to my satisfaction because I'm a real detail person, but I think this one was almost there, right? I don't feel like complete satisfaction with this. But then if you look at Atlanta's files with the police department there are many unsolved cases, so should be easy to find one to cover.
Many.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Jesse, and a kiss to the baby, although the baby's now in school. Jeez, that's crazy.
Jeez.
We're getting old.
That happens.
I know. So next we have an email from Michelle. Michelle writes, "Hi, I listen to your podcast while cleaning my house, folding laundry, cooking, and whenever I have a few minutes to myself, as I'm a really busy mom of 4 children. I just came across a case I wanted you to cover. There's bits and pieces of information here and there. It's on Jesse McFadden from Henrietta, Oklahoma. He killed himself and 6 people, ranging in age from 13 to 35, and did some other horrible stuff as well. I don't drink, so I don't have a brewery to recommend, and I apologize for that." That's okay, Michelle. That's what Dick's here for. He can always find a beer.
Yes, and you don't have to apologize for not drinking.
No, you really don't. I mean, especially with the case we just covered, it might be a good idea not to be drinking.
Good point.
You want to do it in moderation at least. So, what do we know about this case?
So this is a fairly recent case.
Okay.
It's about a year and a half ago. Jesse McFadden killed his wife, her 3 children, and 2 kids that were there that were friends of her kids.
Wow.
He sexually assaulted the 2 young women that he killed, and then he killed himself. Now, this guy had a long history of violence, and he actually had been in prison 17 years for rape.
Oh, and then he got out and did this?
Then he got out and did this. Yeah, I don't know how much time had elapsed from his release to the killings. Actually, in fact, McFadden was to appear in court the day of the killings. He had been charged with sexting an underage female.
Well, you know, these people, these pedophiles, really don't change. I mean, it's almost like a sickness, although I really have no empathy for them. But it really seems like a compulsion. And you hear all the time about them getting out of prison and reoffending. So, good recommendation, and we'll look into it, Michelle. Thanks so much. Then, what else have you got? You got something else at the bottom of the page.
Yes, we have a listener on YouTube, and she wanted an episode on Rock Terrio and the Anthill Kids. So Terrio was the leader of a doomsday cult that was loosely based on Seventh-day Adventist teachings. Since he was the leader, he had numerous wives and concubines. In fact, one of the requirements for females to be in the cult was that they get impregnated by him.
That's kind of common in the cults.
Yes. He was convicted of murder in 1993. I think they got him for 2 or 3 murders.
Of people in his cult?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
But then in prison, he was murdered by a fellow inmate in 2011. So he'd been in prison not quite 20 years.
Yeah. Okay, well, I always love a good cult story, I have to tell you. Fascinating.
Well, read up on this.
I will read up on that because it's very fascinating. So thank you. Well, thanks as always for your feedback and for joining us here at the Quiet End. We do love to be down here and see everybody.
Yeah, we have fun.
We do have fun, yeah. Drink a little beer, have a little chat. It's always a good time.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so we will see you next time at the Quiet End.
Line down. Plenty of seats.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye, guys.